Alright guys, so we're going to go over this build here. This is my Magicka Templar. It's got some pretty ridiculous stats. We're in Vivec right now, so take a look. We have 35k Magicka, 26k health, 15k stam. For a Magicka Templar, that's pretty good. We're in 5 heavy, 1 medium, 1 light as well. One thing to note, this should be a heavy armor shoulder, and these should be medium gloves, but I don't have a heavy shoulder, so if you have a heavy shoulder, go ahead and swap these two armor weights. So we're running 2 Valken Scoria, 5 Shackle Breaker, and 5 Vicious Death on the front bar, and Vicious Death Inferno Staff on the back bar. So it's a dual wield in Destro Staff build. So we also have impen on everything with Tri-Stat Glyphs. Tri-Stat Glyphs is one of the reasons why we have so much stats overall. We get a really decent stam pool, really decent health pool, and a ton of Magicka. So Vicious Death is what the reason why we run this set in particular is because a lot of times my main focus for PvP is fighting large scale groups. So when I kill a single person, this is going to make my AoE damage that much more potent. It's very effective in just wiping 5, 6, 7 people at once with this build. It's very, very strong. I find the sustain to be pretty well with this setup, even though I'm running 3 spell damage glyphs. So you can probably, if you're having a hard time sustaining, swap out this glyph for a cost reduction one, because heavy armor doesn't have a lot of cost reduction. But that would be the only change I would make as far as the glyphs go, potentially. Defending on this staff, and you can use whatever glyph you want. This is just the one it came with. You can use an Absorb Magicka, you can use Weakening Enchant to reduce enemy damage being dealt to you, whatever. The 2 enchants here, though, are kind of important because you want to reduce your main target's spell resist so you can hit harder, and increase your weapon damage and spell damage to hit harder. This allows you to put out a really decent amount of damage. Without, unbuffed, our spell damage is pretty good. This goes up to like 28k fully with entropy procced, so when we have major sorcery. But then we're over 3k with that weapon damage proc, which is really nice. Or that spell damage proc, rather. Our main set is Shackle Breaker, and the reason why we use this is because we're actually using Witch Mother's Potent Brew for the drink. This gives us, pretty much all the stats we want and helps us with our recovery big time. So you can see we have a pretty decent recovery, thanks to both the Shackle Breaker buff and the Witch Mother Potent Brew, and the fact that we're running the Atronach Stone, which is really nice. But also, this gives us some pretty necessary stam recovery. So even just a little bit, I find helps a lot in Magicka characters. Just getting that little extra stam recovery is what's going to be the difference between you not being able to dodge roll out of a negate versus being able to dodge roll out of a negate, or being able to break free at those opportune times, or just die. But also the max stats really help, especially the max stamina on this set really helps offset the fact that we don't get stamina from Witch Mother's Potent Brew. So between those 2 and the Tri-Stat Glyphs, we're able to hit a pretty reasonable number. Like on some of my old Magicka Sorc builds that just ran a purple Tri-Food, they would only have 14k. So this is pretty good actually at 15k. We're sitting at a pretty high stam pool number to be able to do those things reliably, all the breaking free dodge rolling that we need to do. But in addition, this is giving us a ton of max Magicka to also increase our damage and sustain there, and some spell damage, which is really nice. But yeah, so the main reason we use Valken Scoria is actually just for the more burst. A lot of our skills, for example, we have Puncturing Sweep, Radiant Oppression, even Entropy. Sometimes I swap to a different set other than Vicious Death, in which case I run Reflective Light. So all these kind of skills are dots that all can proc Valken Scoria, and especially when you're using Radiant Oppression, when this hits for 12k flame damage, that's a lot of burst damage to have along with your other skills, and people just often die. And if this procs when you're hitting someone and executes them, and then Vicious Death procs, the people around them are going to die, like it's very, very strong. So back to skills real quick. So Proxy Debt, now this is interchangeable. I use this versus large scale groups because it's very strong against those kind of groups, and I like to sync them up with other people in my group. But if you want to swap that out, you can swap it for Accelerating Drain. I know a lot of people use Invigorating Drain, the other morph of this, but I like this one because it gives Minor Expedition, which provides some pretty necessary speed buff that otherwise we wouldn't have on this build. And Templars are very weak because it can be very weak in the mobility department because of their lack of overall speed, and if they get rooted they're in trouble, those kind of things. So this is a good option as well, but because I'm focusing on larger scale fights, keep Proxy Debt here. And we still have ways to be mobile even without the Vamp Drain, so I'll explain that in a bit. Puncturing Sweep, this is our main spammable. Heals us for quite a bit, especially when we're hitting multiple people. Hits pretty decent, but the snare is also really nice. So being able to snare someone for 70% after we just stun them, like the combination of that snare and that stun is very, very strong, because it means, especially Nightblades, they're not going to be able to get away from you easily. Like, you're just going to be able to keep doing this until they're dead. Strongest execute in the game, don't really need to say much more than that. This thing hits ridiculously hard. It can proc Valken Scoria. Puncturing Sweep can also proc Valken Scoria. Just very, very strong execute. You can use this at like 50% even, or like even slightly above, maybe even like 60%. And if one person in your group hits them, this thing's probably going to take them the rest of the way. It's very, very deadly. Toppling Charge, so Gap Closer and our main stun. Now, the other reason why sometimes I use Vamp Drain here, the Accelerating Drain, a lot of people like to block this skill. And you can catch them off guard pretty easily. If they block this and then you immediately animation cancel Accelerating Drain, they become like, it's almost like a fear effect all of a sudden, and it's a hard stun for 3 seconds. So this is really strong to combo with Toppling Charge, because they block this, then they drop block for a second, and then you drain them and then start sweeping, you know, maybe put up Purifying Light before you even start that whole combo. So you have Light, Toppling Charge, drain them for the stun, start putting this on them, and then start executing. This will go off, do a lot of burst damage, and Valken Scoria might proc, and they're probably going to die to the Radiant Oppression because of all that. It's a very, very strong synergistic combo with Accelerating Drain here, taking advantage of the fact that a lot of people do block this. But again, just for now, because again, large scale fights, keep Proxy Debt here. Purifying Light, this skill is absolutely ridiculous. You start this when you go into a damage rotation on someone. You put this up, you Toppling Charge them. If you have the drain, you can drain. Before you Toppling Charge, you can actually debt too. And then once you're up close, you just start sweeping and then execute them with Radiant Oppression, and this thing's likely going to proc and do a ridiculous amount of damage. Especially if Valken Scoria procs, the Valken Scoria will add to this damage as well. So having that extra meteor getting dropped on your opponent's head is really going to ensure that they die to this thing or Radiant Oppression. So this ultimate's pretty swappable. I use a lot of different stuff here. Right now it's just Shooting Star, just because it's a reasonable costed high damage ultimate, but you can also swap out for things like Soul Shatter. I like this morph in particular because it's it's pretty funny when you kill someone with it and then its ability procs for 13k magic damage, and then also Vicious Death procs for another 20k, and like 3 people die because you just killed them. You just killed one person with this. I get great satisfaction out of that. Also, sometimes I'll use one of the morphs here. I'll use Empowering Sweep for damage mitigation. So if you get caught in a large group, the damage mitigation you get from hitting 3 or 4 people from this is actually pretty relevant. So it's really nice to have in place of Meteor here sometimes, because our main ultimate's going to be Eye of Flame anyway. Sometimes, depending on the fights, you can use one of the morphs, a Rite of Passage, or maybe even a Nova, something like that. But you can swap it out quite a bit. Another pretty common one I use is actually Devouring Swarm, because again, when you're outnumbered, this thing heals for a ridiculous amount, and you can just keep sweeping, keep Radiant Oppression going. This will proc Scoria as well, just like the Destro ult will. So it's kind of like a mini Destro ult that heals you, which is nice. And oftentimes I find myself running this too. But yeah, you can be very, very flexible with this ultimate here. Back bar, so Extended Ritual, I like this one especially, as opposed to the Ritual Retribution, because this removes 5 harmful effects as opposed to 2. removing 5 I just find to be absolutely key. There's so many times where, especially if a Nightblade marks you, that's like 3 buffs itself, and then the Ritual Retribution you have to cast multiple times to even get maybe an oil off of you at that point if a Nightblade's marking you. So this will just remove everything. It's pretty reliable. You can get rid of all that garbage that people throw on you. And it just really helps keep you alive. Also provide, you know, it does provide some relevant passive healing, as well as giving you minor mending while you're standing in the circle because of your Templar passives. So this skill is absolutely the reason why we're a vampire. Besides some of the passives that you get for being a vampire, this skill is what provides Magicka Templar with all of its mobility. So the fact that we can completely be immune to root snares and CCs during it is really nice, but it also reduces the damage you take by a ridiculous amount and gives you major expedition. So you can use this kiting around rocks and whatnot very, very effectively. It's not uncommon for people that use the skill, and this build included, to be kiting around entire large groups of enemies, like 12 people around a tree, and it's just, they're going to have a hard time dealing with you. So, and the way to effectively use it when you're coming out of it, like I like to use Misform, and then when I'm about to come out of it, I dodge roll and then cast it again. The dodge roll is going to help prevent people from stunning you while you're trying to go into the next cast, which is really the opportune time to try and stun someone while they're using it. It's one of the few ways you can really lock them down and prevent them from escaping. So Degeneration here, the reason why I use this is just for major sorcery, really. There's not really any other reason. This is the only real Templar option to get major sorcery aside from getting it as part of your gear. And this is what's providing, like we use this to pre-buff when we're starting a fight, just cast it on an enemy, and then it can also proc Falcon Scoria, which is nice, but it doesn't do it super reliably. It just kind of adds up with your other dots and helps cast it, helps proc it, I guess. But the downside to it is it can also proc it when you don't necessarily want Scoria to proc. So like if you cast it on someone just to get the buff, it can proc Scoria, and then when you're actually trying to hit someone, your Scoria is on cooldown. So that's kind of, there's some pros and cons to this, and I've tested other skills in its place, but the major sorcery is really strong. Challenge Focus. Now this is, again, more flexible skills. You can swap this out for various things. Sometimes I swap it out for Retreating Maneuver. It really depends. I'll show you Retreating Maneuver just to get the snare and mobilization removed from my group and be able to push into keeps a little easier. The Major Expedition, that kind of stuff. Moving around Cyrodiil faster. But this gives you a lot of really strong, necessary defensive buffs, raising your spell and physical resist, but also it provides more Magicka sustain, which is great. So even if you don't stand in it, even if you cast it once and walk out, you actually restore more Magicka than the skill cost to begin with, just from the buff it gave. But if you happen to be standing in it for a bit, overall, over time, it's going to actually restore a decent amount of Magicka to you, which is nice, just a little bit more sustain. Also, it does a similar effect to Extended Ritual, where if you're standing in it, you get minor vitality, which is pretty sweet. And then Breath of Life. So this is the main heal. If you're going mainly solo, you can swap to the other morph, which restores Magicka when you cast it on someone below 50%. But again, I usually go with large-scale group fights, fighting against like 24 to 60 people at times. So I like having this to heal one of my buddies too, in addition to myself. And then the main ult for this is Eye of Flame. So the idea with this is this can proc Scoria, and while that's active, you can be sweeping Radiant Impression people and have proxy deck going. So the way to engage a person with this build is to first hit Degeneration, then proc Eye of Flame, use an immovable pot, hit Det, and then push into them. And then by the time, well, actually, excuse me, let me reiterate all this. Use Det first because of the cooldown time. Bar swap, Degeneration, proc Eye of Flame, use an immovable pot, toppling charge into them, puncturing sweep, maybe executes people that are low. You can also cast Purifying Light before you even charge, all this stuff. There's a lot of combo potential here, but the main idea is you want to have an immovable pot up while this is ticking, and while you're in the middle of a group with a proximity debt up. So if proximity debt goes off while this is ticking, like, you're gonna kill people, and vicious death is gonna proc. That's just the beauty of those two skills together. Combining proxy debt with even just devouring swarm does a similar thing, but this actually can be even more potent sometimes because they're trying to beat on you, so they're all standing right around you anyway, so it makes this hit harder. So there is potential there for this to be very strong, but you don't even have to, again, like, oftentimes I just use meteor here too, but it's really up to you. But that's all the skills. So go into potions and food real quick. So for food, again, Witch Mother's Potent Brew. I touched on this earlier. It's mainly just for the regen, the sustain, and then the max stats that you get. It's really the best option for this build. Potions. So there's actually 2 potions I use. This is the main one, getting health and magicka back and becoming immune to disable effects. The other one actually replaces the health with detection. So it'd be immune to knockback and disabling effects, increase your detection radius by like 20 meters, and then restore magicka. I think those are in the bank at the moment, so I'll have to grab them later. But both of those are very, very key for this build, and they provide different utility. This one, just because you don't have a heal on your front bar, so it's very good to have when if you get low, all of a sudden you can pop this and then bar swap and then get ready to Breath of Life if you need to. The other one is mainly just for because of the detection. It provides more group knowledge when you're pushing into keeps. You might have an enemy group stealthed around the corner or something that you don't know about, but you might know about because you have a detect pot active. So it helps give you more knowledge to get the upper hand against other large scale groups. So we've talked about some of the alternate skills, all that kind of stuff. We talked about the strategy. The only real thing left to talk about here is the champion points. So let's start here. Actually, let's start over here. So in the lady, a bunch of points in the hardy, a bunch of points in the elemental defender, because these are your main damage reduction passives, as along with ironclad. This is probably the most important passive to get from the steed, or from the red series of champion trees as a whole, because anyone that's not doing a dot to you is going to get reduced by this. So only dots don't get reduced, pretty much. And then the dots that do damage to you get reduced by thick skin, so we have a decent amount of points here as well. Everything else I put into resistant, because critical resistance is key in Cyrodiil, so we have a bunch of crit resist between gear and that passive. So under the green side, we have a ton of points into magic recovery. This is really key for the sustain because we're in heavy armor to be able to dish out constant damage. You can actually drop this down a bit and put more points into Mooncalf too, if you find yourself having a hard time managing your stamina, and that'll help quite a bit because we do have the Atronach, not the Atronach stone, excuse me. We do have a stamina buff from our Shacklebreaker gear, so this will help just a little. But also keep in mind, because we're running dual wield, you can actually heavy attack with your weapons to get stamina back as well. So weaving heavy attacks in between your puncturing sweeps will keep your stamina up. So that's why I actually keep a lot of magicka here, because I can manage my stamina that way. Warlord. So break free and dodge roll, just like every other build I put a ton of points into both these, because if you can't break free, you're dead. If you can't dodge roll out of negates, you're dead. That's my motto. That's how I go. That's why I choose those 2 champion point passives. They're extremely important. Sprinter. So again, because we're not a sorcerer, we have to run around. We have to use toppling charge for our mobility, all that stuff, and then elusive mist for escaping, that kind of thing. We do an awful lot of sprinting, so we want to help manage our stam with this as well. So that's another important passive. If we go into the blue trees now, we're going to talk a lot about different things. So Thaumaturge and Master at Arms. As far as I know, Puncturing Sweep double dips in both of these. So it actually gets buffed by Thom because it's a dot, but it also gets buffed by Master at Arms because of the way it works. Being able to hit the closest enemy to you for a high amount of damage is, I think, what is causing this ultimately to be buffed by Master at Arms. But there may be a possibility that it shouldn't be. This also buffs other things though, like toppling charge proximity debt. So it's good to have here. So both of these I would have regardless of whether this buffed puncturing sweep or not. And then we get a lot of extra damage from Elemental Expert. Again, everything we have is Magicka based, so this buffs all of our skills. And then spell penetration, because we're in heavy armor, so we want that spell pen to help deal more damage because we're lacking it from not being in light armor. And then we have some points in Elfhorn. Now our spell crit's not super high, so I didn't put a lot of points here, but we still want a decent, like, I would say this is the bare minimum to get the reach we need to be able to actually proc Vicious Death by killing a person. But that's basically the whole idea there. That's all the champion points. Now there's one other thing I just remembered. I do have an alternate set that I run sometimes in place of Vicious Death. I'm missing the Inferno Staff for it, so right now I just don't have it active in my back bar, or have the 4-piece active in my back bar. But you can actually swap in Rattle Cage for Vicious Death if you're in like smaller scale fights in the situations where you would maybe not be running Proxy at, maybe be running what's it called here, the Accelerating Drain anyway, so my bar might look something like this. And then I would swap out Entropy for Reflective Light. So the way this now works, we get the major sorcery from Rattle Cage and a ton of spell damage. So now you can see our spell damage is over 3k already, and if this procs, this enchant, we're going to be pushing 3.5, 3.6k spell damage, which makes us hit really hard. And because we already have major sorcery from the gear, we can actually swap out Entropy for Reflective Light. This is much better of a skill because it provides us a reliable snare so that we can then gap close and get in with Puncturing Sweep more reliably, and reduces our our opponent's mobility overall. But it also gives us a spell crit buff, so we again hit harder, bigger reach, be able to bring someone down to proc Vicious. Well, we can't proc Vicious Death. What am I talking about? But more reach to be able to bring someone down faster. And because we're not running Proxy, that like this thing is really good too. So more mobility, nice CC, all good stuff. So this is a very good alternative to Vicious Death, or even if you just don't like running Vicious Death, you can run this instead, and you still have ridiculous stats like almost 28k health, 33k Magicka, 15k stam. This build just hits ridiculously hard. Bunch of Magicka recovery, decent stam recovery. This is actually more than it seems like because of heavy attacks and Constitution passive for heavy armor. There's a bunch of different things here that synergize really well, and I've found a lot of success with this build. Spell resist and physical resist are also extremely high, which is nice. Critical resist is very high. Physical could be better, but spell resist is pretty good because when we proc, when we use channel focus, we're now hitting 23k spell resist and 20k physical, so that's pretty good. That gives us enough of a buffer to be reliable with Breath of Life healing. So very strong build overall, guys. Give it a try. I mean, Betty White's pretty sweet too anyway, so look at that. It's awesome. Super evil, badass. What do you expect from Betty White? All right, have a good one, guys.